My guest today is a journalist. For many, many years, he worked in private radio and television, and then he moved to CBC Television, where he spent the bulk of his career. And many of you will remember him from his reporting on Here and Now, the Supper Hour News. It's my pleasure to welcome to the program Mr. Rick Seaward. Hi, Rick.
Hi. How are you?
Now, let's go back to your days as a kiddie in the airport town of Gander. That's really where you caught the news bug, isn't it? All those years ago.
Well, I kind of always had an interest in news, dating way back. I can remember being 5 years old in Port-aux-Basques at my grandparents' house when the king died, and being riveted to the radio, listening to the coverage at 5 years old. And I always had an ongoing interest in news. Growing up in Gander, in those days we all had AM radios, and at night you could get in faraway stations. They would come in from the United States and so on. And I had a radio by my bed, and I used to fall asleep listening to WINS in New York City, which is an all-news radio station.
Wins.
Wins, yeah. And I can remember the Kennedy assassination and being fascinated, riveted to the TV with Walter Cronkite's coverage of that, right, when I was older. And yeah, it's always been there, but I don't know where it comes from.
Now, when you were younger, there were two people in your life who, I guess, were a very positive influence on you in terms of figuring out what you were going to do career-wise. One was a school teacher, the other was a clergyman. Tell me about them.
Well, we attended Fraser Road United Church in Gander. We lived right across the street from it and went every Sunday. And Reverend Sturge was my father used to call him a real NDPer. And he would sermonize about commercialism and so on, and all the causes of, he was supporting Tommy Douglas and that kind of thing. And there were progressive influences in my early life, I think, which stayed with me. And but there was another religious influence which was probably even more dominant when I think about it. There was a Roman Catholic TV show, I think it was called the Sacred Heart Hour. It used to come on TV in those days. And right at the beginning of each show, there was video of a little birthday candle against a black background being lit, and a voice quoting some ancient theologian saying, "Better to light one little candle than to curse the darkness." And you know, that always, it made an impression on me. I don't know if it was the repetition or what, but it stayed with me as, wow, what a way to treat life. Go through life doing what you can, one little person, using your own abilities to accomplish what you can. And later on, I told that story to my friend Ted Bartlett. And whenever I'd break a story that nobody else had, that stirred things up, he would say, "Rick, lighting another candle, are you?" And anyway, it was a bit of a joke, but it had a profound effect on my approach to life, right?
But how did you pick journalism? Like what?
Well, the journalism thing, I always liked writing. I always liked writing essays in school. And Mr. Brown, our grade 10 teacher, Bert Brown, who later wound up here in St. John's, assigned us to write an essay on time, the topic time. Anyway, I wrote up as best I could something, and I ended it with the line, "Mankind will never conquer the infinite summit of Mount Time." And anyway, he was impressed with the writing. He read it out to the class, and he said, "I think we have the makings of a journalist here." So after that, whenever anybody would ask me what I wanted to do in life, I would say, I think I want to be a journalist. And that was when my mind got turned to journalism as a career.
And then you went to MUN, and you were no sooner at MUN before you were getting paid to be a journalist. VOCM hired you.
Right.
Talk about that.
Well, I approached VOCM with the idea that I could be a campus correspondent for them, just keeping an eye on interesting stuff that was on the go and so on. And they agreed they would pay me a penny a word for reports. And I tell you, I used to write some long-winded reports for VOCM, but every week I'd go in and get my little check, and it was pocket money, you know.
Now, did you receive any instruction from VOCM as to how to write a story, to shape your story, or did you just kind of?
Well, I wound up working in the newsroom. I got married, and I had to get serious about a career. And I went to work for the VOCM newsroom. And Elmer Harris was the news director, and Jerry Kirby was his assistant. And they were really good role models for me in terms of digging out stories. I just watched what they did and tried to emulate them. And so I remember one time there was Joey Smallwood used to drive into VOCM every day from Roach's Line on his way to Confederation Building, drive up the driveway and park by the side of the building. And Elmer or Jerry would go out and interview him for 15 minutes, and it was aired an hour later at 10:15 on a program called Conversation with the Premier. And I was always making suggestions to them about things they should ask the Premier. And I think one day they decided to have a bit of fun with me, and they asked me to go do the interview. So I went, they gave me a list of questions. I think there were about 8 questions there. And I took them out. And Joey used to roll down the window in the car, and you put your microphone in the window and interview him this way. And I went out, and he said, "Let me see that." And he grabbed the piece of paper from me, and he went down to that one, and he said, "Not that one. Not that one, not that one, not that one." And he left me with about 2 questions to ask. And here I was in a new job, trying to impress my bosses.
That's about all Joey needed, 2 questions.
Joey, you're exactly right. He did the 15-minute interview on just 2 questions.
Yeah.
But I was so green, I didn't have the sense to challenge him or anything, you know. And anyway, but it was, I got to know him. He was quite a tyrant. Anyway, I think Jerry and Elmer probably had a laugh at sending me out, sending the rookie out to get a lesson in what life was going to be like, right?
So how did television happen? What was the attraction for you in terms of television?
Well, what happened was at VOCM, they were on a network of private radio stations that fed reports to each other about news from their region, right across Canada. And I was a frequent contributor to that network. And one day I got a call from Jerry Kendrick, who was the news director at CHNS in Halifax. And he offered me a job in Halifax, doubling my salary at VOCM. And I didn't bat an eye. I mean, I went home and told my wife, and she was glad enough about it as well. We doubled our salary and moved to Halifax within a couple of weeks. and so on. But after about a year there, I was homesick for Newfoundland. I missed Newfoundland. And I got a call from CJCH Television in Halifax, which is the dominant station in that market by far, and still is to this day. But they had a news program on, and they invited me to be a guest panelist on the news interview show. And anyway, I did that, and anyway, we interviewed for the interview Robert Stanfield, who had just been elected national leader of the PC party, and it was my questioning of him that they used on the news that night. And anyway, it what would amaze me was the audience reaction to what you were doing. It was just so pervasive, the coverage that you got. And I was attracted to TV. So anyway, I went back home and thought about CJON back in Newfoundland. And I knew Freeman White, the news director, and I called him up just to see if he had any openings coming up in the off chance that he would. And he hired me on the spot. And a couple of weeks later, we were moving back to CJON.
So when you started out reporting for CJON, were you a beat reporter, or were you expected to do 2-3 stories a day?
Yeah, basically, it was pretty informal. There were no structured story meetings or anything like that. Everybody would come in on their own and contribute. It was mainly copy. News Cavalcade in those days was mainly copy with some film. And so each reporter's job was to produce as many stories as you could during the day. And my experiences at VOCM had taught me how to dig stories. So I fitted in pretty well there, I think, right?
Now, Rick, over the years, I mean, things changed a lot in news gathering. I mean, 40 years ago, there was one way of doing news, TV news especially, and today, completely different. Just talk about the changes you saw over the course of your time in the business.
Well, the big thing, I mean, is technology, right? It took over. When I started, you had a typewriter and a tape recorder, a portable tape recorder. Over time, we developed electronic news gathering where everything was videotaped. Today, it's digital cameras. I mean, everything that you do an interview, and it's on a little device, and everybody within a TV organization relies on social media and information that's circulating around to select their story ideas from to broadcast. So that was the big shift I noticed over time. Was in my day, we would dig stories. There weren't as many news conferences and organized events for the media. We would dig stories and put them on the air and so on. But today, there's less digging.
Mm. Who are some of the newsmakers who stood out to you during your career? I mean, you covered a lot of different people over several decades. Any that kind of really sort of...
in terms of influential people to me, I'd have to say John Crosby and Clyde Wells.
Mm-hmm. Why?
They were opinion leaders from my generation. And we all admired their gumption in standing up to Smallwood, who was widely regarded as a tyrant, and I'm dearly beloved in many parts of Newfoundland, there's no doubt about that. But he had an arrogance about him and so on that turned a lot of people off, and an authoritarian manner. but both were men of principle and decent. And that's what I remember about them. I also remember for the same thing, another decent person was Ed Roberts. Thoroughly decent man, and bright, educated, competent, would have been premier if Joey hadn't formed the Reform Party in 1975 and prevented him, split the Liberal vote and prevented him from winning the election against Frank Moores.
Then came CBC. How did that happen, that you ended up working for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation as a television reporter on Here and Now?
Well, I applied. I've always dreamed of working for the CBC. I grew up in Gander listening to the CBC, and I knew all the personalities and so on. And it was a dream job. And I had a friend, Richard Beaton, from the CBC, who I worked with in Halifax, got to know at CHNS, and he wound up back here. So I called him up and said, look, Richard, let me know when there's a vacancy posted on your bulletin board. I'd like to apply. And one day I got a call from him. And sure enough, there was an opening, and I applied, and I got it. Now, what happened, I think what sold them on me, I told them that I got a lot of satisfaction out of generating stories that nobody else had, digging out stories, and I think that's what convinced them to hire me. So when they did hire me, I felt I had a mandate and an obligation to generate as many stories as I could to meet their expectations. And that's what I did. I concentrated on generating stories that nobody else had or was likely to have just by digging. And anyway, it worked out.
And many of these stories are what you'd classify as investigative. There was one that stands out in my memory, and we used to refer to it as the Bell Island boom story. Boom as in bang, big bang. Tell us about the Bell Island boom.
Well, as it happened on the ground, it was a very strange phenomena. There was a tremendous atmospheric explosion, and immediately a flash in the sky that people in Topsail saw as a straight beam of light strike the island. And I later had interviews of those people. But there was an electrical discharge throughout Lance Cove on Bell Island. And the copper wiring in one house was vaporized. About a 2-foot blue flame shot out from wall outlets. Balls of fire formed in the air. And in one house, it went through the exterior wall, creating a hole about 3 feet wide, a circle, and destroyed a TV, rendered it a complete shambles, and then exited on the opposite wall into a 3-foot hole. Anyway, it was a mystery what caused it, and it attracted scientific speculation from all over, whatever. And anyway, there were 2 geologists on Bell Island when I went over that thought it might have been a meteorite, and they were checking that out. And I got to know them. And one evening, I got a call from one of them saying that they had been contacted by 2 people from the Los Alamos nuclear research facility in New Mexico, and they were investigating high altitude explosions, and they wanted to meet me. And would I be willing to come and meet them at the Holiday Inn that evening? So I jumped at the chance, right? And I did. And we went over and we had a chat, and the two of them just sat there. They didn't talk. They just listened to me and the geologist talking about what had happened. But towards the end of the evening, they agreed to allow me to accompany them the next day to go over to Bell Island and bring along a cameraman with me, but no interviews. So I did that and shot some video of them and so on. Anyway, going back on the ferry, one of them, Robert Fryman, said he was a weapons design engineer from Los Alamos, and that he had an interest in the process that caused lightning to form into a ball, because if they could harness that process, they might be able to generate weapons out of it. Anyway, that was his interest and reason for being there. The other guy, John Warren, was a plasma physicist, an expert on ball lightning. But they wouldn't do any interviews, and they went on back to New Mexico. And anyway, that was the story from there. But after all of that happened, I went over to the university library and did some checking, just on the hunch to see if there'd been anything similar anywhere else along the Atlantic seaboard. And I checked the indexes of the Washington Post and New York Times and found out that when you looked up the word boom, there were all kinds of entries, hundreds of them. Booms that had been happening all along the Atlantic seaboard, some of them in New Jersey and South Carolina, sounded remarkably similar to what we had experienced here on Bell Island. And anyway, it was of such concern down there, Jimmy Carter in the White House had the Naval Research Board do an investigation of the phenomenon to see what it was. And they found out that there were classes of booms. Some of them were sonic booms from like the Concorde. Some of them were sonic booms caused by the ones with flashes of light were sonic booms from military aircraft which were interacting with peculiar weather conditions at the time, and they put it down to there. And that was the extent of that report. So I contacted Fryman in Los Alamos before I did my documentary on it, and put it to him, and it turned out that he had been expecting the Bell Island boom to happen. He didn't know it was going to happen in Newfoundland, but because of the experiences in South Carolina and New Jersey, which experienced something similar because of weather conditions in the Atlantic that had moved inland for some reason, and that's what happened. The flashes in New Jersey and South Carolina and Newfoundland all tripped the warning signals on military satellites, and they thought that there were nuclear explosions going off high in the atmosphere. And that was why they were interested in, and he said when he predicted that it was going to happen in the North Atlantic, and when it did, somebody in Washington, quote unquote, asked me to check it out. So they came up and whatever.
Rick, I'll always remember an iconic image of you kneeling down on the ground with a Geiger counter. Tell me about that story.
We got a paper that was done by a student at Memorial who was from Long Harbor, which had a giant phosphorus plant that Joey Smallwood had brought in. And anyway, Bill Goff, who was the executive producer, asked Ken Meeker and myself to have a look at it to see what we could do with it. And one of the things that she found was that the plant was processing radioactive ore with trace elements of uranium. I went over to the university library, went back to Miami-Dade County, where the ore originated from, and found out that it was a massive scandal down there in all the newspapers, because houses built on reclaimed mining land, which contained the uranium, people were developing lung cancer. Uranium, it seems, decays into radon gas, which built up in a confined space causes lung cancer. And the plant out there was giving out waste from the plant to people to put in their basements. So Ken knew a geologist who went and got samples from the site, and we sent them away to 3 independent labs in the United States for analysis. A couple of months later, got the results back, sent them off to a nuclear scientist in Toronto for analysis and interpretation, and he said that the plant was actually enhancing the radioactivity of the uranium out there, and the slag, the waste from the plant, was highly dangerous, that workers at the plant should be wearing badges to monitor their exposure to radiation, and so on. The Moores government, which had set up a task force of scientists and doctors to do a study of the Urco plant because of an earlier documentary we had done on fluoride contamination, got them to look at our analysis in our documentary and confirmed everything, and the company was forced to remove the slag from all the basements of people in the area that had been using it.
Amazing. Rick, we've run out of time. We could probably keep going for another hour, but I appreciate your being on the program to reminisce. Thank you.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's it for this edition of Karl Well's Point to Point. Please join us again next time.